Hello, and welcome back to Chill and Feel Chronicles. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to settle in. Wherever you are watching from, tell us in the comments where you are and what time it is there. Perhaps it is late at night, with the lights around you slowly fading into darkness. Perhaps you are already lying comfortably in bed, listening quietly as the world outside begins to grow still. Now, close your eyes if you wish, take a slow breath, and let us travel back several centuries. It is night time on the Indian Ocean. Under a vast sky scattered with stars, wooden sailing ships move slowly across the dark water. Their sails catch the warm ocean wind as they carry precious cargo across thousands of miles. Spices from distant islands, silk from the east, tea, porcelain, cotton, and silver. To the people aboard these ships, these were more than simple goods. They were opportunities, fortunes, and perhaps the promise of becoming unimaginably wealthy. But behind these peaceful-looking voyages was something far more extraordinary. Because some of the ships belonged not to kings, and not to governments, but to companies. Private trading companies created by merchants and investors. And slowly, these companies began to become something the world had never quite seen before. So how could a private company own armies? How could merchants build forts, capture cities, collect taxes, wage wars, and eventually rule over millions of people? This is the strange and fascinating story of the East India Companies. They began as small commercial organizations, established to search for profitable trade routes and distant markets. Yet over time, some grew so powerful that their influence rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of entire kingdoms. Their story is not simply about trade. It is a story about money, ambition, power, war, diplomacy, and human desire. Tonight we will step aboard their ships, walk through their trading ports, enter their fortified settlements, and follow the remarkable rise of companies that learned how to rule like kingdoms. So, wherever you are tonight, let the noise of the modern world slowly disappear. Get comfortable, relax, and allow yourself to drift back into an age when a company could become an empire, and when the line between business and government almost disappeared. Welcome to the companies that ruled like kingdoms. Long before private companies began to build armies and govern distant territories, the world was already connected by an extraordinary network of trade. It was a world where ships crossed dangerous seas, caravans traveled across deserts, and merchants moved slowly between cities, separated by thousands of miles. And among all the goods that traveled along these ancient routes, few were more precious than spices. Imagine entering a European marketplace several centuries ago. The scent of unfamiliar spices fills the air. Black pepper from the east, cinnamon from distant lands, cloves and nutmeg from the islands of Southeast Asia. These small pieces of dried plants could command extraordinary prices. To European consumers, spices were not simply ingredients. They could represent wealth, status, medicine, preservation, and luxury. A handful of pepper might travel through the hands of dozens of merchants before finally reaching a European kitchen. The journey was long, and every stage added another layer of cost. The trade routes connecting Asia with Europe were not controlled by one empire or one group of merchants. Instead, they formed a vast and complicated web stretching across the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. Ships carried goods between ports. Caravans crossed deserts. Merchants negotiated in crowded bazaars. And great cities became meeting points where products, languages, religions, and fortunes came together. Silk traveled westward from China and Central Asia. Cotton and precious textiles moved through India. Spices came from the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. Gold, ivory, and other valuable goods moved through African trading networks. And from the Mediterranean, these treasures eventually found their way into European markets. One of the great beneficiaries of this system was Venice. For centuries, Venetian merchants occupied an important position between the eastern Mediterranean and Western Europe. Their ships connected European markets with ports farther east, while merchants and middlemen helped move luxury goods toward the wealthy cities of Europe. But there was a problem for the kingdoms of Western Europe. They wanted the riches of Asia. They wanted spices, silk, porcelain, precious stones, and other luxury goods. Yet reaching those goods directly was extremely difficult. Between Europe and the markets of Asia stood enormous distances, dangerous seas, powerful states, competing merchants, and established trading networks. Every intermediary wanted a share of the profits. For European rulers and merchants, the dream was simple: find a direct route to the east. If they could sail directly to the source of the spices, they could bypass many of the merchants who stood between Asia and Europe. The potential rewards were enormous, and gradually European kingdoms began investing in exploration. Among them, Portugal became one of the most ambitious. Portuguese sailors pushed farther down the coast of Africa, exploring unfamiliar waters and searching for a route around the continent. Their voyages were difficult and dangerous. They faced storms, unfamiliar currents, disease, shortages of food and water, and the constant uncertainty of sailing beyond the known world. But slowly, the map began to change. Portuguese expeditions reached farther south, then farther east. And eventually, the great geographical barrier of Africa was overcome. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sea in the late 15th century, the consequences were enormous. Europe had found a maritime connection to the Indian Ocean. The old trading world did not disappear overnight. Venetian merchants remained important. Middle Eastern and Asian traders continued to dominate many established commercial networks. But a new possibility had appeared. European ships could now sail directly into the heart of the Indian Ocean. And where there was a new route to wealth, there would soon be new competition. At first, these voyages were about trade, but trade required protection. Protection required forts. Forts required soldiers. Soldiers required money. And money created even greater ambitions. The age of the great trading companies was approaching. Before long, merchants would not simply follow empires. They would begin creating powers of their own, and the world of spice and silk would never be quite the same again. At the end of the 15th century, the Indian Ocean was already one of the busiest commercial worlds on Earth. Long before European ships appeared on its horizon, merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, East Africa, and Southeast Asia had been crossing these waters for centuries. Their ships followed the seasonal monsoon winds, carrying pepper, cinnamon, cloves, textiles, precious stones, ceramics, gold, and countless other goods between distant ports. This was the world that Vasco da Gama entered. In 1497, da Gama departed Portugal with a small fleet, beginning a voyage that would change the history of global trade. His ship sailed south along the coast of Africa, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and then turned east across the Indian Ocean. The journey was long and dangerous, but in 1498, the Portuguese fleet finally reached the western coast of India. Da Gama arrived near Calicut, one of the most important trading centers on the Malabar coast. To the Portuguese, reaching India felt like the discovery of a commercial doorway into Asia. But to the people already living there, this was not a new world waiting to be discovered. It was an old and sophisticated trading system. Calicut was a cosmopolitan port connected to merchants from across the Indian Ocean. Arab and Persian traders had long been involved in the spice trade. Indian merchants controlled important commercial networks. Ships arrived from East Africa, Arabia, Southeast Asia, and other regions, bringing goods from across the wider world. Pepper was particularly important. The Malabar coast produced enormous quantities of it, and pepper was one of the products the Portuguese desperately wanted to obtain directly. But the Portuguese soon discovered that arriving in India was much easier than controlling the trade. They were newcomers entering a commercial system that already had its own rules, relationships, and powerful participants. And the Portuguese did not intend merely to become another group of merchants. They wanted to control the routes themselves. That ambition changed the nature of the Indian Ocean trade. Instead of relying entirely on negotiation, the Portuguese increasingly relied on military power. Their ships were equipped with cannon. Their fleets could threaten merchant vessels and ports. And along the coast, they began constructing fortified settlements designed to protect their interests and project Portuguese power. The strategy was simple but revolutionary. Control important ports. Control strategic sea routes. Protect Portuguese. Force competitors to recognize Portuguese authority. And collect revenue from the trade flowing through the region. Fortresses became essential to this strategy. Stone walls rose beside the sea. Cannon were positioned to command harbor entrances. Portuguese ships anchored near important ports, creating a visible reminder that this new commercial power was backed by military force. Among the most important places eventually came Goa. Captured by the Portuguese in 1610, Goa developed into the center of Portuguese power in Asia. Its harbor provided an important base for ships, merchants, soldiers, administrators, and missionaries. From Goa, Portuguese influence could reach across the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese Estado da India was not a single enormous empire covering the entire region. Instead, it was a network of fortified ports, naval bases, trading posts, and strategic territories. Its strength came from controlling key points, rather than controlling every piece of land, and the ocean itself became part of the battlefield. Portuguese commanders attempted to regulate maritime commerce through passes, patrols, and naval force. Ships that wanted to trade in certain waters could be pressured to obtain Portuguese authorization. The logic was startling. A trading company or kingdom did not necessarily need to own the entire ocean. It only needed enough ships, forts, and guns to make other merchants afraid to challenge it. For centuries, Indian Ocean commerce had depended heavily on seasonal winds, established relationships, and commercial cooperation. Now cannon began to change the equation. Trade could be protected by force. Ports could be threatened by fleets. And a merchant ship could become part of a military confrontation. The Portuguese had brought European naval warfare into an already sophisticated commercial world. But they were not alone for long. Other European powers were watching. They saw the wealth flowing through Asian ports. They saw the profits created by spices and textiles, and they saw something else. They saw that military power could be used to protect commercial interests, and perhaps to create monopolies. The Portuguese arrival therefore marked more than the beginning of a new trading relationship. It represented the beginning of a new era in which commerce and warfare became increasingly intertwined. The Indian Ocean was no longer simply a highway for merchants. It was becoming a contest for control. And somewhere in Europe, merchants and investors were beginning to imagine an even more powerful idea. What if private companies could build fleets of their own? What if they could establish ports? What if they could negotiate treaties, wage wars, and control distant markets? The Portuguese had demonstrated the possibility. Soon, others would attempt to perfect it. And the companies that followed would become far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. By the beginning of the 17th century, European nations had already discovered that immense wealth flowed through the seas of Asia. The Portuguese had opened maritime routes to the Indian Ocean. Spanish ships crossed the Pacific. Merchants across Europe dreamed of spices, silk, porcelain tea, and fortunes beyond imagination. But among all the organizations that emerged during this age of commerce, one stood apart. It was not a kingdom. It was not an empire. It was a company. And in time that company would become one of the most powerful commercial institutions the world had ever seen. In 1602, merchants in the Dutch Republic joined together to create the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials, the VOC. At first glance, the idea seemed simple. Many smaller trading groups had been competing with one another in Asia, often driving up costs and weakening Dutch influence. The government encouraged these merchants to unite into a single organization, giving it special privileges and support. What emerged was something remarkably new. The VOC was not merely a partnership lasting for a single voyage, as many earlier trading ventures had been. It became one of the world's first large-scale joint stock companies. People could invest money in the company by purchasing shares. Investors became shareholders. Profits from trade could be distributed among many people rather than belonging to a single merchant or noble family. For the first time, ordinary wealthy citizens, merchants, and investors could participate in distant trade without ever setting foot on a ship. The idea was revolutionary. Risk was shared. Capital was gathered from many sources, and enormous sums of money could be collected to finance fleets, warehouses, expeditions, and military protection. The shares of the VOC could even be bought and sold, creating one of the earliest examples of a stock market. In cities like Amsterdam, commerce began to take on a new form. Trade was no longer only about ships and cargo. It was also about investments, dividends, and expectations. The VOC became a machine for transforming money into even greater wealth. But what made the company truly extraordinary was not merely its financial structure. It was the powers it received. The Dutch government granted the VOC rights that were usually reserved for states. The company could negotiate treaties. It could establish colonies. It could build forts. It could maintain armies and fleets. It could wage war. Imagine that for a moment. A company created for profit possessed powers once associated only with kings and empires. The line between commerce and government was beginning to fade. Across the seas of Asia, the VOC expanded its influence. Ships sailed to India, Ceylon, Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. Warehouses rose beside harbors. Fortifications guarded strategic ports. And gradually, the company focused its attention on one of the most profitable trades in the world: spices, nut, cloves, mace. These small products, grown mainly in parts of the Indonesian archipelago, were worth extraordinary amounts in Europe. Nutmeg, in particular, was so valuable that its price could multiply many times between its place of origin and European markets. Control over spices meant control over immense wealth, and so the VOC sought not simply to participate in the spice trade, but to dominate it. To achieve this, the company established its most important Asian center at Batavia, on the island of Java, in present-day Indonesia. Founded in 1619, Batavia became the beating heart of the Dutch commercial empire in Asia. From its ports, fleets departed across the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Officials managed trade, merchants stored valuable goods, soldiers defended the company's interests. Batavia was not merely a trading post, it was a corporate capital, a city governed in the service of commerce. The Indonesian archipelago became central to VOC ambitions. Through alliances, negotiations, monopolies, and sometimes violence, the company attempted to control the production and distribution of spices. It wanted cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, pepper from various ports. And it wanted competitors excluded. Sea routes were monitored, ports were fortified, ships carried both cargo and cannon. The ocean had become a place where trade and military power moved together. The profits could be astonishing. Year after year, valuable cargoes crossed the seas toward Europe. Warehouses in Amsterdam filled with spices, Portstein tea, and luxury goods. Investors received dividends. Merchants grew wealthy. Cities prospered. At its height, the VOC became one of the richest corporations in history. If we were to compare its value with modern companies, historians estimate that its wealth would equal many trillions of dollars in today's money. Yet its importance cannot be measured only in coins or cargo. The VOC introduced a new idea into world history, that investors, gathered in distant cities, could pool their wealth, that a company could command ships, soldiers, and territories. That profit could become a force shaping politics, diplomacy, and war across entire oceans. The Dutch East India Company was not merely a business. It was a new kind of power, neither kingdom nor republic, neither army nor merchant guild, but something that combined all these things together. And as Europe watched the success of the VOC, others learned an important lesson. If one company could become this powerful, perhaps others could do the same. Soon, another organization would rise. One that would eventually govern vast lands, command hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and transform the destiny of millions. Its name was the English East India Company, and its story was only just beginning. There is a simple reason why spice became so important to the Dutch East India Company. It was not enough to sell something valuable. The real power came from controlling how much of it existed, who could sell it, and who was allowed to buy it. In the 17th century, this idea transformed the spice trade. A merchant who simply purchased cloves or nutmeg could make a profit. But a company that controlled the source of those spices could do something far more powerful. It could decide the price, it could restrict supply, and it could prevent competitors from entering the market. This was the logic of monopoly. For the VOC, the Indonesian islands were therefore much more than distant territories. They were strategic assets. The Moluccas were famous for cloves, while the Banda Islands were particularly important for nutmeg and mace. These islands were small, but their economic importance was enormous. To European consumers, spices were luxury products. To the VOC, they were the foundation of a commercial empire. The company wanted to make sure that the supply of these valuable products remained under its control. And that meant controlling the places where the spices were grown. At first, the VOC attempted to achieve this through agreements and contracts. Company officials negotiated with local rulers. Treaties were signed. Exclusive trading arrangements were established. Local authorities were encouraged or pressured to recognize Dutch commercial privileges. The documents could look peaceful, but behind them stood fortified ports and armed ships. The VOC possessed something many ordinary merchants did not: military power. If a local ruler refused to cooperate, the company could bring pressure by sea. If another European power attempted to enter the market, Dutch warships could respond. If merchants tried to trade outside the company's regulations, their activities could be restricted. The result was a dramatic transformation. The Indian Ocean had long been a place of commercial exchange involving many different peoples. Arab merchants sailed alongside Indian traders. Chinese merchants traveled between Southeast Asia and coastal markets. Local communities produced spices and negotiated with foreign buyers. Prices were shaped by supply, demand, relationships, seasons, and competition. But the VOC increasingly wanted to replace this complicated marketplace with something more controlled. The company did not want everyone to trade. It wanted the right people to trade, its people. And it did not simply want access to spices, it wanted exclusive access. This created growing tension with local merchants. For generations, many communities had depended upon regional trade. Merchants understood the winds, the ports, the languages, and the relationships that connected the Indian Ocean world. They knew where products were available and where prices were highest. The arrival of a powerful European company changed the balance. The VOC could offer contracts backed by government authority. It could establish warehouses. It could build forts. And it could place armed ships along important routes. Suddenly a local merchant was not simply competing against another merchant. He could be competing against an organization with its own soldiers and navy. This was one of the most important developments of the era. Trade was becoming militarized. A cargo ship was no longer merely carrying merchandise. It could also be part of a strategic network. A harbor was no longer just a place where merchants exchanged goods. It could become a fortified military base. A contract was no longer simply a commercial agreement. It could be supported by political pressure, and a company headquarters could function almost like a government office. The VOC's fortresses became symbols of this transformation. Stone walls overlooked important harbors. Cannons pointed toward the sea. Soldiers guarded warehouses filled with valuable cargo. Ships waited offshore, ready to protect Dutch interests. Everything was connected. The fortress protected the harbor protected the ships protected the trade, and the trade generated the profits that financed the entire system. This created a powerful cycle. More control produced more profits. More profits allowed the company to build more ships and forts. More military power allowed it to impose greater control, and greater control made the monopoly even stronger. But monopoly came with another consequence. It changed the meaning of competition. In an ordinary marketplace, competitors attempt to offer better prices, better products, or better service. In the VOC's world, competition could be treated as a threat. A rival merchant was not merely someone trying to make money. A rival European company could represent a political danger. A foreign ship could threaten a carefully protected supply chain. A local trader could undermine an exclusive agreement. The company therefore had an incentive to remove competition, rather than simply defeat it economically. This is where the boundary between business and government became increasingly difficult to see. The VOC had been created to make profits, yet it exercised powers normally associated with states. It negotiated treaties, it maintained soldiers, it operated fleets, it controlled territory, it established courts and administrative institutions, and it could use force to defend commercial interests. The company had effectively become a political actor. But there was something even more remarkable about this arrangement. The people making decisions in European offices were often thousands of miles away from the communities affected by those decisions. A boardroom in Amsterdam could influence events on islands in Southeast Asia. A decision about the price of nutmeg could affect an entire local economy. An agreement signed by company officials could reshape the lives of merchants, farmers, rulers, and sailors. The distance between the investor and the consequences of investment was enormous, and yet the system worked. At least for a time, the VOC became incredibly wealthy because it had discovered that controlling a product could be more profitable than simply selling it. The Spice Islands were no longer viewed merely as places of production. They became pieces on a much larger strategic board. Ports became assets. Forts became tools of commerce. Warships became guardians of profit, and contracts became instruments of power. The transformation was subtle at first. A merchant company built a warehouse, then a fort, then a fleet. Then it negotiated a treaty. Then it demanded exclusive rights. And eventually, the company possessed many of the characteristics of a state. This was the great paradox of the age. The companies had been created because governments wanted more trade, but as the companies became richer, governments gave them more power, and as they gained more power, they became capable of shaping politics themselves. The distinction between business and government was beginning to disappear, and somewhere across the seas, another company was preparing to take this idea even further. The English East India Company would soon discover that the greatest profits did not always come from controlling spices. Sometimes, they came from controlling the land itself. At the beginning of the 17th century, the seas leading toward Asia were already crowded with ambition. Portugal had established itself across important parts of the Indian Ocean. The Dutch were rapidly building their own commercial empire. Asian merchants had been trading across these waters for centuries, and now England wanted a place in this extraordinary world. On the last day of 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group of English merchants. The organization became known as the English East India Company. At first it seemed almost modest compared with the great kingdoms and established trading networks of Asia. But its ambitions were anything but small. The charter gave the company exclusive rights to English trade with territories east of the Cape of Good Hope. Investors provided the money, merchants organized expeditions, and ships were prepared for journeys into waters that were still unfamiliar to many English sailors. The company's first voyages were difficult. Ships had to travel enormous distances. Months could pass before they reached Asian ports. Crews faced storms, disease shortages, and the constant danger of shipwreck. And even after reaching Asia, there was no guarantee that merchants would be welcomed. The Portuguese were already there. The Dutch were becoming increasingly powerful. Local rulers controlled ports and territories. Indian, Arab, Persian, Armenian, and other Asian merchants had established their own commercial relationships. The English therefore entered a world in which they were newcomers. They could not simply arrive and expect to dominate. They had to learn. They needed to understand local politics. They had to negotiate with rulers. They needed warehouses where goods could be stored. They needed safe harbors for their ships. And above all, they needed access to the enormous Indian market. One of the most important early relations was Surat, on the western coast of India. Surat was a major commercial center connected to the Arabian Sea and wider Indian Ocean trade. Merchants gathered there from different regions, and ships carried textiles, spices, indigo, precious goods, and other products toward markets across Asia and beyond. For the English East India Company, Surat represented an opportunity, but it also represented a lesson. The company could not survive simply by competing with European rivals at sea. It had to become part of the existing Asian commercial system. English merchants negotiated with local authorities and sought permission to establish trading facilities. These early establishments were known as factories, although they were not factories in the modern industrial sense. They were commercial settlements where company employees could store goods, conduct business, negotiate contracts, and coordinate shipments. They became the physical foundation of English influence in India. The company's strategy was gradually taking shape: build relationships, secure trading privileges, establish permanent bases, move valuable goods, and protect the company's interests. At first, the English were primarily interested in commerce. Indian textiles became especially important. Fine cotton fabrics from India were highly desirable in international markets, and the company also sought spices, indigo, silk, saltpeter, and other valuable commodities. But every commercial success created new competition. The Portuguese were unwilling to surrender their position easily. The Dutch were even more formidable. The VOC possessed enormous resources, powerful fleets, and extensive experience in Asian waters. The English East India Company therefore had to learn how to survive between rival European powers while negotiating with powerful Asian states. This required patience. Sometimes the company negotiated, sometimes it competed, sometimes it used force. And increasingly, it understood that commercial power needed protection. Ships carried cannon. Trading settlements were fortified. Company officials developed relationships with local rulers and political elites. Slowly, the organization began to resemble the model established by the Dutch. A company could not simply think about buying and selling. It had to think about security. It had to understand diplomacy. It had to understand military power. And it had to understand politics. This was an important transformation. The company had been created by merchants seeking profit. But the world it entered demanded something more. A successful merchant in Asia needed to understand kings, governors, soldiers, ports, taxes, and alliances. The English East India Company gradually became more than a collection of traders. It became an institution capable of operating across continents. Its ships connected England to India and beyond. Its factories connected English merchants to Asian markets. Its investors connected distant commercial ventures to financial interests at home. And its growing network gave England a permanent presence in Asian trade. Yet the company was still far from becoming the immense political power it would eventually become. In these early decades, it was learning how to survive. It was learning from the Portuguese. It was watching the Dutch. And it was adapting to the sophisticated commercial world already established across Asia. The most important lesson was perhaps the simplest. Trade alone was never enough. To protect trade, the company needed influence. To gain influence, it needed allies. To defend those allies and its own interests, it needed soldiers and ships. And once a company possessed soldiers, ships, forts, and political agreements, the distance between a merchant organization and a state became smaller than ever. For now, however, the English East India Company remained primarily a trading enterprise. Its greatest transformation was still ahead, because the company would eventually discover the most valuable commodity in India was not always a spice, a textile, or a precious stone. Sometimes, the greatest source of wealth was power itself. To understand how the English East India Company eventually became a political power in India, we first need to understand something very important. India was not an empty land waiting for European rulers to arrive. It was not a place without governments, armies, wealthy cities, or organized commerce. Long before the British Empire established political control, the Indian subcontinent was home to one of the world's largest and most sophisticated economies. At the center of much of northern India stood the Mughal Empire. During its most powerful periods, Mughal rulers controlled enormous territories and governed millions of people. Their courts were wealthy, their cities were magnificent, and their administration connected distant provinces through systems of taxation, trade, and government. Delhi was a major political center. Agra was famous for its imperial court architecture and wealth. Bengal was one of the richest regions of the subcontinent, and along the western coast, cities such as Surat connected India to the wider commercial world of the Indian Ocean. These were not isolated places. They were part of an enormous network. Ships arrived from Arabia, Persia, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe. Caravans carried goods inland. Merchants moved between cities. Money changed hands in crowded markets. And behind all of this was an economic system that had been developing for centuries. Consider the textile industry. Across India, skilled artisans produced cotton and silk fabrics of remarkable quality. Weavers worked in villages and towns, often using techniques passed from one generation to another. Some fabrics were simple and practical. Others were extraordinarily fine, decorated with intricate patterns and colors. Indian textiles became highly desirable in international markets. European merchants were fascinated by them. Cotton cloth from India could be lighter, more colorful, and more versatile than many fabrics produced in Europe. For the English East India Company, these textiles became one of the most important reasons to remain in India. But the company was entering a market it did not control. It had to negotiate. It had to purchase goods through existing networks. It had to understand local prices. And it had to deal with merchants who already knew exactly how the system worked. Indian merchants were not passive participants waiting for European buyers. They were experienced businessmen operating across enormous distances. Some controlled caravans, others financed ships. Some specialized in particular commodities. Others operated through networks of agents and partners, scattered across different cities. Bankers and money changers played another crucial role. Large commercial transactions required sophisticated financial arrangements, and merchants developed systems for transferring money and settling accounts over long distances. Credit could move across regions without large quantities of physical coin having to travel with every shipment. For a European company accustomed to thinking about distant trade from the perspective of London, this was an entirely different commercial environment. The company had to learn the language of business. It had to understand local customs. It needed reliable intermediaries. And it had to build relationships with officials who controlled access to ports, markets, taxes, and transportation. This was particularly important in Bengal. The region was famous for its fertile lands, dense population, skilled artisans, and valuable textile production. Its rivers connected inland production centers with major ports. Goods could move through waterways before eventually reaching international markets. For merchants, Bengal was a treasure. For the East India Company, it was an opportunity that would become increasingly important. But opportunity did not mean easy control. The company had to compete for supplies. Other European merchants wanted the same textiles and commodities. Local traders wanted the best prices. Governments wanted taxes and customs duties. And powerful political authorities could grant or withdraw commercial privileges. In this world, business depended heavily on relationships. A company might negotiate a favorable agreement with one ruler, only to discover that another official controlled the next stage of its trade. A merchant might secure a shipment of cloth, but then face changing prices, transportation problems, or political uncertainty. Nothing was automatic. The East India Company therefore had to adapt. It learned to operate within existing Indian systems, rather than simply trying to replace them. Its factories became places where European merchants interacted with Indian producers, bankers, brokers, and officials. Its employees learned which markets were most profitable. They developed networks of local contacts. They established relationships with powerful figures, and slowly, the company became more deeply connected to the Indian economy. This is an important part of the story because it reveals a great paradox. The British did not initially come to India because India lacked wealth. They came because India already possessed enormous wealth. Its textiles were valuable. Its agricultural production was immense. Its cities were prosperous. Its merchants were experienced. Its markets were connected to a global trading network. The East India Company wanted access to that existing prosperity. At first, it was a guest in a powerful economic world. It needed permission to trade. It needed protection. It needed cooperation. And it needed to convince Indian authorities and merchants that doing business with the company could be profitable. But as the decades passed, the balance began to change. The company accumulated capital. Its factories expanded. Its political connections grew. Its military capabilities increased. And European rivalries created opportunities for intervention. The company was slowly learning something that would transform its future. India's economy was already powerful. But India's political landscape was complex, and where political divisions existed, a company with money, soldiers, and ambition could sometimes find opportunities that ordinary merchants could not. The East India Company had entered India as a trader. It had come looking for textiles, spices, and profit. Yet the longer it stayed, the more it began to understand the political world around it. And eventually, it would stop asking only how to trade with India. It would begin asking a far more dangerous question. What if it controlled the conditions under which trade itself took place? When the English East India Company first established itself in India, its settlements did not look like the capitals of an empire. They looked like places of business. Warehouses stood near the water. Merchants moved between markets and ships. Clerks recorded transactions. Bales of cotton and silk were stacked inside buildings, and company employees negotiated prices with local traders. These places were known as factories. But the word had a very different meaning in the 17th and 18th centuries. A factory was not a place filled with machines producing goods. Instead, it was a commercial establishment where company representatives, known as factors, lived and worked. A factory could contain warehouses, offices, living quarters, and facilities for storing valuable merchandise. It was a place where trade was organized. But these settlements gradually became much more than simple warehouses. The company discovered that a trading post was easier to protect when it had walls. A warehouse filled with valuable goods was vulnerable. A harbor could be attacked. Merchants could be threatened. Rival European powers could attempt to seize important positions. So the company began constructing fortified settlements. One of the most important was Madras, on the southeastern coast of India. There the company established Fort St. George. The fort became a center of English commercial activity and administration. Inside its walls were warehouses, offices, residences, and defensive positions. Outside the fort, a growing settlement developed around it. Merchants arrived. Artisans settled nearby. workers found employment, markets appeared, and gradually a trading post began to resemble a city. A similar transformation occurred at Bombay, on India's western coast. The English gained control of Bombay in the 17th century, and its excellent harbour made it extremely valuable. For the company, Bombay offered a strategic base on the Arabian Sea. Ships could arrive, cargo could be stored, and military forces could be stationed there. The port also became an important centre for trade. Over time, Bombay expanded far beyond its original commercial settlement. The same pattern would later appear in Bengal. At Calcutta, the East India Company established Fort William. The location was strategically important, because Bengal was one of the richest regions in India. Its textile production was enormous. Its river systems connected inland markets to the sea, and its commercial networks reached far beyond the region itself. Fort William became both a defensive structure and an administrative center. Around it, Calcutta expanded. What had begun as a company's settlement gradually developed into a major city. This transformation reveals something important about the East India Company's rise. The company was not simply moving into India. It was creating permanent spaces in which its own authority could operate. Within these settlements, company officials managed trade, company employees lived under company rules, warehouses stored company goods, and armed guards protected company property. The company was beginning to possess something that ordinary merchants did not: territory. Not always large territories. Not always territories fully independent from local rulers, but enough land to build walls, warehouses, offices, residences, and military facilities. And with territory came responsibility. The company needed administrators. It needed clerks. It needed interpreters. It needed merchants. It needed engineers and builders. And increasingly, it needed soldiers. Protection became a permanent part of commercial life. Cannons were mounted on walls. Guards watched entrances. Ships protected harbors. And armed forces could be called upon when negotiations failed. The company was slowly creating its own miniature worlds. Inside the walls of a fortified settlement, commercial and political authority began to overlap. A company official might negotiate a business contract in the morning and discuss security with soldiers in the afternoon. A warehouse might stand only a few steps away from a cannon battery. A merchant might depend upon the same institution for both commercial services and military protection. The distinction between business and government was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. And this transformation was not accidental. The more valuable the company's trade became, the more it needed security. The more security it created, the more authority it acquired. The more authority it acquired, the easier it became to defend its commercial interests. A cycle was forming. Trade created wealth. Wealth financed forts. Forts protected trade. Protected trade created more wealth. And eventually that wealth could finance something even more powerful: a standing military force. At first, the East India Company had arrived in India as a foreign merchant. Then it became a network of trading posts. Then those trading posts became fortified settlements, and those settlements began developing into cities. Inside them lived employees, merchants, soldiers, administrators, and local communities whose lives increasingly became connected to the company's presence. The company was still officially a commercial organization, but it was beginning to look very different from an ordinary business. It had territory. It had employees. It had warehouses. It had forts, had ships, and had armed men. Quietly, almost step by step, the East India Company was becoming something much larger than a trading enterprise. It was becoming a political force. And soon, it would discover that the greatest power of a company did not necessarily come from the goods stored inside its warehouses. It came from the people standing outside them, carrying muskets and guarding the walls. For much of the 17th century, the English East India Company was learning how to survive in the complex commercial world of India. But the English were not alone. Across Europe, other powers were watching the enormous wealth flowing from Asian markets. France wanted a share. And when French merchants and officials entered the Indian Ocean, competition between European companies became even more complicated. The French established the French East India Company in the 17th century, with the goal of expanding French trade across Asia. Like its English and Dutch counterparts, the company was created to pursue commercial opportunities far from Europe. French merchants were interested in spices, textiles, silk, and other valuable goods. But they quickly discovered the same reality that confronted the English. India already had powerful rulers, wealthy merchants, established markets, and sophisticated trading networks. To succeed, the French needed permanent bases. One of the most important became Pondicherry, on the southeastern coast of India. Over time, Pondicherry developed into the center of French influence in the region. French buildings, warehouses, administrative offices, and defensive walls transformed the settlement into an important commercial and political base. From there, French merchants could participate in India's textile trade and connect with wider markets across the Indian Ocean. The French presence also created a new problem for the English. They were no longer competing only against the Portuguese or Dutch. Now, another European power had arrived with its own ships, merchants, soldiers, and ambitions. The competition between Britain and France became especially intense during the 18th century. Both sides understood that control of trade required more than warehouses and ships. They needed political relationships. India was not governed by a single centralized power. The Mughal Empire remained enormously influential, but regional rulers, governors, military leaders, and emerging states possessed significant authority. This created opportunities. European companies could support one local ruler against another. In return, they might receive trading privileges, territory, political influence, or military assistance. The relationship could be mutually beneficial. An Indian ruler might want European soldiers or weapons. A European company might want access to a port or commercial privileges. Both sides had something the other wanted, and gradually European companies became involved in local political struggles. This was one of the most important turning points in the story. The English and French were no longer simply competing for customers. They were competing for influence. They began supporting different political factions. They provided troops, military supplies, and advisors. European officers trained local soldiers. Company forces fought alongside Indian allies, and political disputes that might once have remained regional could become connected to the larger rivalry between European powers. The Carnatic Wars demonstrated this transformation. These conflicts, fought largely in southern India during the 18th century, were closely connected to wider European wars. Britain and France were rivals in Europe. When war broke out between them, their competition could spread across the oceans. A conflict thousands of miles away could suddenly affect Madras, Pondicherry, trading posts, ships, and local rulers. The Indian Ocean had become part of a much larger geopolitical system. European wars were no longer confined to Europe. They could be fought in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and across the world's oceans. This created an extraordinary situation. A dispute between European monarchies could determine which company controlled a port in India. A battle in India could affect European trade. A treaty signed in Europe could change alliances in Asia. Commerce and diplomacy were becoming inseparable. For merchants, this was both an opportunity and a danger. Political influence could protect trade. Military alliances could secure markets. But political involvement also meant that companies could become trapped in conflicts they did not fully control. The French and English increasingly needed local allies. They negotiated with Indian rulers. They promised military assistance. They supported competing candidates for political power. And each victory could strengthen a company's commercial position. Each defeat could weaken it. The companies were gradually learning that a trading post was not simply a place to store goods. It could be a strategic asset. A fort could protect a harbor. An army could protect a treaty. A political ally could protect a monopoly. And a successful military campaign could create new commercial privileges. The distinction between merchant and soldier was becoming blurred. The distinction between company and government was becoming even harder to see. Yet there was a crucial difference between the English and French experiences. France's involvement in India remained heavily dependent on the support of the French state. The English East India Company, while also benefiting from British military and political power, increasingly developed its own independent military and administrative capabilities. This difference would eventually become enormously important. For the moment, however, both companies were playing the same dangerous game. They entered India's political world as outsiders. They supported local allies. They competed for ports and influence, and they used European rivalries to strengthen their positions. But every alliance carried a price. Every military victory created new obligations. Every fort required protection. Every political promise created expectations, and every expansion made it harder to return to simple commerce. By the middle of the 18th century, the English and French were no longer merely merchants trying to sell goods in India. They had become political players. The battlefield and the marketplace were beginning to overlap. A company could make money through trade. It could gain influence through diplomacy. And it could protect both through military power. The great question was no longer whether European companies would become involved in Indian politics. They already had. The question was, which company would emerge from this struggle with enough power to dominate the others? The answer would begin to take shape in Bengal. By the middle of the 18th century, the English and French East India Companies had moved far beyond the simple business of buying and selling goods. Both had ships, both had fortified settlements, both had armed soldiers. And both understood that political influence could be just as valuable as commercial privilege. Now, their rivalry was about to become a series of wars. These conflicts became known as the Carnatic Wars, fought primarily in southern India during the 18th century. They were closely connected to the larger rivalry between Britain and France. But in India, the struggle became something much more complicated. European powers were not fighting alone. Indian princes, governors, nobles, and military leaders had their own ambitions. They had their own rivalries, and they were often willing to cooperate with whichever European company could help them achieve their goals. This created a fascinating and dangerous political landscape. The English might support one claimant to power. The French might support another. An Indian ruler could become an ally one year, and an enemy the next. And the companies could use these relationships to expand their influence. The result was a world where commercial competition, increasingly looked like international warfare. The companies maintained their own armies. European officers trained troops in European military methods. But many of the soldiers serving these companies were Indian. These locally recruited troops, often known as sepoys, became essential to the military power of both the English and French. They provided the manpower necessary to fight large campaigns across the subcontinent. A European company could therefore project power far beyond the number of Europeans actually living in India. The formula was becoming clear. European officers, Indian soldiers, European weapons, local alliances, company money. Together, these could create a military force capable of influencing the politics of entire regions. The Carnatic Wars demonstrated how powerful this combination could become. In southern India, succession disputes created opportunities for European intervention. When powerful local leaders competed for authority, the English and French could support different sides. Their assistance was rarely free. In exchange for military support, companies expected political rewards, trading privileges, territorial concessions, financial payments, and influence over local governments. This transformed political succession into a commercial opportunity. A company could help determine who became ruler and then expect the new ruler to reward that assistance. One of the most important figures to emerge from this environment was Robert Clive. Clive began his career as an employee of the English East India Company, but he became known for his military and political abilities during the conflicts in India. His career demonstrated just how far the role of a company employee could evolve. He was no longer simply a merchant. He could command soldiers. He could negotiate with rulers. He could organize military campaigns. And he could influence political outcomes. During the struggle for influence in the Carnatic, Clive gained a reputation for bold decisions and unconventional strategies. One of the most famous episodes came in 1751, when he led the English capture and defense of Arcot. The operation was important, not only because of the military result, but because it demonstrated how a relatively small company force could influence a much larger political struggle. The English were learning that military success could create political leverage. And political leverage could create commercial advantages. The French were learning the same lesson. Their leaders also supported Indian allies and attempted to expand French influence through military and diplomatic means. For a time, French power appeared capable of challenging the English. But the broader conflict between Britain and France increasingly favored the English. The balance shifted. English military organization improved. Company resources expanded. And British naval power helped support the company's position in India. The Carnatic Wars eventually demonstrated a fundamental truth about the new age of empire. A company did not need to conquer an entire country to become politically powerful. It only needed to influence the right people, support the right ruler, control the right fort, protect the right port, and maintain enough soldiers to make its agreements meaningful. This was very different from traditional empire building. A European king might send an army to conquer territory directly. The East India Company often operated through alliances. It could support local rulers while gradually increasing its own influence. The company therefore became a political force, without initially appearing to be a traditional government. But there was a darker side to this transformation. Every alliance created obligations. Every military intervention created enemies. And every political victory increased the company's responsibilities. If a company helped place a ruler in power, what happened when that ruler refused to cooperate? If two Indian princes competed for authority, which side should the company support? And if a political dispute threatened company profits, could the company remain neutral? Increasingly, the answer was no. The company's interests demanded intervention. Trade demanded security. Security demanded soldiers. Soldiers demanded political decisions. And political decisions led to more intervention. The cycle continued. By now, the English East India Company had become something profoundly unusual. It was a private corporation with its own military forces, operating thousands of miles from its headquarters. Its employees negotiated treaties. Its officers commanded armies. Its merchants influenced rulers. Its ships protected commercial interests. And its decisions could determine the political future of entire regions. The Carnatic Wars therefore represented a major turning point. They showed that European companies were no longer simply competing for access to Indian markets. They were competing for political power. And once a company learned that it could influence who ruled, the possibilities became enormous. The question was no longer, who can sell the most goods? It had become, who can decide the rules under which everyone else must trade? The answer would soon emerge in Bengal. There, the English East India Company would face a powerful ruler, and the confrontation would change the history of India forever. By the middle of the 18th century, Bengal had become one of the most valuable regions in India. Its fertile plains supported a large population. Its rivers created natural routes for transportation. Its cities were centers of commerce, and its textile industries produced goods that were eagerly purchased by merchants from Asia and Europe. For the English East India Company, Bengal represented something even more important. It was an enormous source of wealth. The company already maintained trading settlements in the region, including Calcutta and Fort William, but tensions between the company and the ruler of Bengal were growing. The young ruler was Siraj ad-Dowlah. He had inherited a powerful position, but he faced a difficult political environment filled with competing interests, wealthy merchants, court officials, and ambitious military leaders. The East India Company was also becoming increasingly assertive. Company officials expanded their fortifications around Calcutta and continued to enjoy commercial privileges that local authorities believed were being abused. Siraj ad-Dowlah demanded greater control over the company's activities. The confrontation eventually became unavoidable. In 1756, Siraj ad-Dowlah captured Calcutta. For the East India Company, this was a serious shock. The loss of Calcutta threatened its commercial position in Bengal, but the company responded quickly. Robert Clive was sent with company troops to recover the settlement. Calcutta was retaken. Yet Clive understood that simply recovering the city was not enough. The deeper problem remained. As long as Siraj ad-Dowlah controlled Bengal, the company's position could remain vulnerable. Clive therefore began looking for allies. And this is where the story of Plassey becomes much more complicated than a simple battle between two armies. Behind the scenes, political negotiations were taking place. Several influential figures in Bengal were dissatisfied with Siraj ad-Dowlah. Among them was Mir Jafar, a senior military commander. Clive and his allies began negotiating with him. The basic arrangement was extraordinary. If Mir Jafar supported the overthrow of Siraj ad-Dowlah, the company would support him as the new ruler. Money and political rewards would follow. The fate of Bengal was increasingly being decided not only on the battlefield, but in private meetings, secret agreements, and financial negotiations. Then, in June 1757, the opposing forces met near the village of Plassey, along the Bhagirathi River. Siraj ud-Daular's army was much larger than Clive's force. On paper, the English appeared to be heavily outnumbered, but numbers were not the only factor. Trust mattered. Leadership mattered. And above all, alliances mattered. As the battle began, large portions of Siraj ud-Daular's army did not fully engage. Mir Jafar and other commanders remained largely inactive, waiting to see how events would unfold. The battlefield became a strange mixture of artillery fire, maneuvering, uncertainty, and political calculation. The company forces maintained their position. Rain affected weapons and ammunition. Confusion spread through the opposing army, and gradually Siraj ud-Daular's position collapsed. The battle itself was relatively short compared with the enormous political consequences that followed. Siraj ud-Daular fled the battlefield. His regime fell, and Mir Jafar was installed as the new Nawab of Bengal. For the East India Company, the victory was transformative. It had entered the conflict claiming to defend its commercial interests. But after Plassey, it possessed something far more valuable than another trading privilege. It possessed enormous political influence. The company could now expect financial payments and concessions from the new regime. Its position in Bengal became dramatically stronger, and its leaders had learned a lesson that would shape the next century. Political power could produce commercial wealth on a scale that ordinary trade could never match. Plassey was therefore more than a military victory. It was a demonstration of how a private company could use alliances, money, diplomacy, and military force to influence the government of a major Indian region. The company had not conquered all of Bengal in a single battle, but it had changed who held power. And once that happened, the company's commercial position became much easier to protect. Its influence expanded, its wealth increased, its military capabilities grew, and its ambitions became larger. The victory also revealed the importance of Bengal's enormous financial resources. The company could now draw upon a region with extensive agriculture, manufacturing, taxation, and trade. Revenue from Bengal could help finance further military campaigns. Military campaigns could produce more territory and political influence, and those territories could generate even more revenue. A powerful cycle was beginning. Wealth financed armies. Armies secured political power. Political power generated more wealth. This was fundamentally different from the world of the early East India Company. The company had once depended on permission from Indian rulers to establish factories. Now, it could influence who became ruler. That distinction was enormous. A trading company had crossed a political threshold. It was no longer simply operating inside a powerful economy. It was beginning to shape that economy, and the consequences would spread far beyond Bengal. Within a few years, the company's authority would become even more formalized. It would gain access to revenue on an enormous scale. Its army would grow. Its territories would expand. And millions of people would increasingly find themselves living under the influence of an organization that had originally been created by merchants seeking profit. The Battle of Plassey did not create the British Empire in India overnight, but it opened the door. Behind that door stood a new kind of power, a corporation with soldiers, a commercial organization with political ambitions, and a company that had discovered that controlling territory could be far more profitable than simply trading within it. The age of the merchant was slowly becoming the age of the ruler. After the Battle of Plassey, the English East India Company entered a new and unfamiliar world. For decades, its primary purpose had been trade. Its employees bought textiles, spices, silk, and other valuable goods. They negotiated with local rulers. They managed warehouses and ships. They calculated profits. But now, the company possessed something it had never truly controlled before: political power. And political power created responsibilities and opportunities that ordinary merchants had never faced. The transformation became especially clear in Bengal. After Plassey, the company gained enormous influence over the Nawab and the administration of the region. But influence was not enough. The company wanted a more reliable source of income. Instead of simply making money by buying and selling goods, it could now collect revenue from the land itself. This was the beginning of a profound change. In 1765, after further military and political developments, the Mughal emperor granted the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The Diwani gave the company the right to collect revenue in these territories. Think about what that meant. A company originally created by merchants now possessed authority over one of the most important revenue systems in India. It was no longer simply selling products. It was collecting taxes. The money collected from the countryside could help finance the company's administration and military forces. And those military forces could then be used to protect and expand the company's political position. The cycle had become even more powerful. Revenue supported the army protected revenue, and political authority made the entire system possible. The company's employees therefore began taking on roles that looked increasingly like those of government officials. They were no longer concerned only with trade. They dealt with taxation. They supervised local administration. They negotiated political agreements. They managed territory. They dealt with disputes. They collected information. And they increasingly influenced the daily lives of millions of people. The transformation was remarkable. A merchant could now become an administrator. A company official could become a political decision-maker. A trading post could become the headquarters of a regional government. The vocabulary of commerce remained, but the reality was changing. The East India Company still spoke about profits, but it was now exercising governmental authority. This created enormous demands. Governments required administration. Administration required officials. Officials required salaries. Territories required security, and security required soldiers. The company therefore needed a larger and more organized military force. Its armies grew substantially, relying heavily on Indians, soldiers commanded by European officers. The company had effectively created a private military establishment capable of fighting major wars. This was an extraordinary situation. In Europe, governments raised armies to defend states. In India, a private corporation maintained armies to protect its commercial and political interests, and those interests were becoming increasingly difficult to separate. The company's territories generated revenue. Revenue financed military power. Military power allowed the company to expand its territories, and expanded territories generated more revenue. But there was another problem. What happened when company employees became extremely powerful? The distance between India and London was enormous. Messages could take months to travel between the two. Company officials in India could make important decisions long before directors in London even learned about them. Some employees became extraordinarily wealthy. Opportunities for corruption and private enrichment increased. Company servants could use political influence to benefit themselves, their associates, or the company. The growing wealth of returning company officials began attracting attention in Britain. These men were sometimes called nabobs, a term derived from the Indian title Nawab. They returned to Britain displaying enormous fortunes. They purchased estates, they entered politics. They influenced elections, and they became symbols of the immense wealth being extracted from Britain's expanding influence in India. This raised an uncomfortable question: who was really in control? Was the company controlling India, or was India transforming the company itself? And perhaps even more importantly, who controlled the East India Company? The company was technically a private corporation owned by shareholders. Its directors were responsible for managing its affairs. But its activities now affected British foreign policy, international diplomacy, taxation, warfare, and the lives of millions of people. The British government could not simply ignore it. A company might start a war. A company might sign a treaty. A company might acquire territory. And the consequences could affect Britain itself. The more powerful the East India Company became, the more difficult it was to treat it as an ordinary business. It was now too important to be left entirely to private interests. Yet it was also too powerful to be easily controlled. This created a strange constitutional problem. A private company was exercising public authority. Its shareholders expected profits. Its directors managed distant territories. Its armies fought wars. Its officials collected taxes, and the British state was increasingly forced to decide how much freedom this corporation should have. The East India Company had crossed another invisible boundary. It had begun as a merchant organization. Then it became a trading network. Then a military power. Now it was becoming a government. But governing was far more complicated than trading. A company could calculate profits. A government had to deal with famine, law, rebellion, taxation, infrastructure, justice, and public order. And the consequences of failure were no longer measured only in financial losses. They could be measured in human lives. The East India Company had entered a world where every commercial decision could become a political decision. Every military campaign could become a financial burden. Every tax could affect millions of people. And every mistake could threaten the reputation of Britain itself. The company had gained enormous power. But power created a new problem. Someone had to control the company. And in London, an increasingly nervous government was beginning to realize that the corporation it had created was becoming too powerful to remain completely independent. The age of the merchant ruler had reached a dangerous new stage. The question was no longer whether the company governed. It clearly did. The question was, who would govern the company? After the East India Company gained control over Bengal's revenue, the nature of its wealth began to change. Before Plassey, the company had depended largely on trade. It bought textiles, spices, silk, and other goods, then transported them across the seas and sold them for profit. But now, the company had access to something even more powerful: revenue collected from the land itself. Money began flowing from Bengal into the company's financial system. Taxes collected from farmers, landholders, and local communities helped support the administration and military forces of the company. At the same time, Bengal continued to produce valuable textiles and agricultural goods that were traded across international markets. For the company, Bengal seemed almost limitless in its potential. For some of its officials, the opportunities were even greater. Company servants who had arrived in India with modest positions could return to Britain with extraordinary fortunes. These wealthy returnees became known as nabobs, a British adaptation of the Indian title Nawab. Their sudden wealth attracted enormous attention. Some purchased large country estates. Others entered British politics. They displayed expensive clothing, hosted lavish parties, and lived lifestyles that seemed almost unimaginable to ordinary people. The rise of the nabobs created a growing debate in Britain. Where had these fortunes come from? Were they the legitimate rewards of successful commerce, or were they the result of corruption, political influence, exploitation, and the misuse of company power? Criticism grew louder. The East India Company was no longer simply a group of merchants making profits overseas. It was collecting taxes, controlling territory, maintaining armies, and influencing political decisions. And the enormous wealth returning from India made the company's growing power increasingly controversial. But while fortunes accumulated at the top, Bengal was experiencing profound economic and environmental pressures. Then came disaster. In 1770, Bengal suffered one of the most devastating famines in its history. A severe failure of the monsoon contributed to widespread crop shortages. Agricultural production declined, food became scarce, prices rose, and millions of people faced hunger. The famine was not caused by taxation or company policy alone. Weather, crop failure, disease, market conditions, and existing social vulnerabilities all played important roles. But the East India Company's system of revenue collection and administration became part of the tragedy. The company still expected revenue from a region whose agricultural economy had been devastated. Farmers who had lost crops still faced financial demands. Local communities struggled to obtain enough food, and the systems that had once connected producers, merchants, and markets were placed under enormous pressure. The tragedy revealed the danger of governing primarily with commercial objectives. A merchant can decide whether to buy or sell. A government must decide how much tax to collect when people are starving. A company can calculate profits. A government must consider the survival of the population under its authority. The East India Company was now being forced to confront precisely this contradiction. It wanted revenue, but the people producing that revenue were suffering. It wanted stable markets. But famine destroyed the ability of communities to participate normally in those markets. It wanted political stability, but economic hardship could create resentment, migration, disorder, and desperation. The famine therefore exposed the darker side of the company's transformation. The same system that generated enormous wealth for investors and officials could create enormous suffering for ordinary people when it failed to respond to crisis. The human cost was immense. Villages were devastated. Families were separated. Farmers abandoned their homes in search of food. Artisans and laborers lost customers as local economies collapsed, and disease followed hunger, making an already terrible situation even worse. The exact number of deaths remains debated by historians, but the scale of the disaster was enormous. Millions of people are believed to have died across the affected region. And while the famine cannot be explained by a single cause, it became a powerful symbol of the problems surrounding company rule. The East India Company had been created to make money. Now it governed millions of people. That contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. In Britain, critics increasingly questioned the company's conduct. How could a private corporation possess armies? How could its officials become enormously wealthy while the people under its authority suffered? How could shareholders in London profit from a territory thousands of miles away? And how could the British government allow a company to exercise powers normally associated with the state? These questions became increasingly urgent. The company had become rich enough to influence politics in Britain itself. Its officials returned home with fortunes. Its directors controlled an enormous overseas organization. Its military forces expanded, and its political responsibilities continued to grow. But wealth created its own dangers. The more money the company controlled, the more attractive it became to investors, politicians, officials, and ambitious individuals. Corruption became a major concern. The boundaries between private enrichment and public authority became increasingly blurred. And the famine demonstrated that the consequences of these decisions were not abstract numbers on a balance sheet, they were human lives. For the people of Bengal, the transformation of the East India Company was not simply a story about markets or corporate expansion. It was a transformation of power. The company had arrived as a merchant. It had become a tax collector. It had become an administrator. It had become a military authority. And now, it was being forced to confront the responsibilities of government without having originally been designed to govern. The great wealth of the company and the great suffering of Bengal existed side by side. One flowed toward shareholders, merchants, and officials. The other was experienced in villages, farms, markets, and homes. And this contrast would eventually force Britain to ask a question it could no longer avoid. If a private company could govern millions of people, should it still be allowed to govern them at all? By the late 18th century, the East India Company had become something that was increasingly difficult for Britain to understand. It was still a private corporation. Its shareholders expected profits. Its directors managed its affairs. Its merchants continued to conduct international trade. Yet the company also controlled enormous territories, collected taxes, maintained armies, negotiated with rulers, and influenced the lives of millions of people. The question facing Britain was becoming unavoidable. Could a private company really be trusted with the power of a government? For years, the British government had allowed the company considerable independence. After all, the company had been useful. It generated wealth. It expanded British influence overseas. And it helped Britain compete against European rivals. But the company's growing political power created new problems. The financial difficulties of the company became increasingly serious. Its military commitments were expensive. Its administration was complicated, and scandals involving company officials damaged its reputation. In Britain, politicians began debating whether the East India Company had become too powerful to remain beyond effective government supervision. The crisis eventually led to one of the most important changes in the history of corporate power. In 1773, Parliament passed the Regulating Act. This was the first major attempt by the British government to directly regulate the East India Company's political activities in India. The act did not abolish the company. It did not immediately transfer all authority to the British government. Instead, it created a new system, in which the company continued to operate, but under greater political supervision. One of the most important figures in this new arrangement was Warren Hastings. Hastings became the first Governor-General of Bengal under the new system. His position reflected the changing nature of British power. He was still closely connected to the East India Company, but he was no longer simply a merchant managing commercial affairs. He was now responsible for administration, diplomacy, military policy, taxation, and relations with Indian rulers. The role itself demonstrated how far the company had traveled from its original purpose. The Regulating Act attempted to bring greater structure to this unusual form of government. The Governor-General was given authority over important aspects of administration in Bengal, while a council was established to oversee his decisions. The British government also increased its involvement in the company's affairs at home. But the arrangement was far from simple. Who exactly was responsible for decisions in India? The company? The Governor-General? The directors in London or Parliament? The new system created overlapping responsibilities. The company still owned its commercial organization. Its shareholders still expected dividends. Its directors still managed many aspects of its business. But Parliament increasingly claimed the right to supervise matters that affected British national interests. The East India Company was becoming neither fully private nor fully public. It occupied an unusual space between the two, and this experiment continued. The Regulating Act was only the beginning. The problems of governing India through a private corporation remained unresolved. There were disagreements over authority. There were disputes between company officials. There were concerns about corruption. And there were continuing questions about how British policy should be conducted in India. Eventually, Parliament introduced further legislation. One of the most important developments came with Pitt's India Act of 1784. This act strengthened government oversight and created a board of control in Britain. The system became even more complex. The East India Company retained its commercial identity and many administrative functions. But the British government gained greater control over political and military affairs. In practical terms, Britain was creating a system of dual control. The company still existed. It still conducted trade. It still employed officials. It still administered territories. But the British state increasingly directed the larger political strategy. This arrangement reflected a fundamental change in British thinking. The company had once been considered a useful instrument of national expansion. Now, the government recognized that the instrument itself had become powerful enough to require supervision. The irony was remarkable. The British government had originally granted the company privileges because it wanted private merchants to take commercial risks overseas. The company then used those privileges to build forts, raise armies, collect taxes, and acquire political influence. Now Parliament had to intervene to control the organization that had grown out of those original privileges. The East India Company was still powerful, but its independence was shrinking. The government could no longer simply allow the directors to make decisions that might affect Britain's international position. India had become too important. The company's armies were too large. Its territories were too extensive. Its finances were too closely connected to British politics. And its actions could no longer be separated from the interests of British state. Yet this did not mean that company rule immediately disappeared. Far from it. For decades, the company would continue to govern large parts of India. Its officials would continue to collect revenue. Its armies would continue to fight wars. Its merchants would continue to pursue profit. The difference was that the British government was now standing behind them and increasingly above them. The relationship between company and state had changed forever. The East India Company had begun as a private enterprise seeking commercial opportunities in Asia. It had become a military organization, then a territorial power, then a government, and now it was becoming something else. A government operating under the supervision of another government. This strange arrangement would shape British rule in India for generations, but it also raised a deeper question about power itself. If a company could become powerful enough to govern millions of people, where should the limits of corporate authority be drawn? And if the government was ultimately responsible for what the company did, could Britain still claim that the company's actions were merely private business? The answer was becoming increasingly clear. The East India Company was no longer an independent corporate kingdom. Its future was now tied directly to the British state. And eventually, That relationship would become even closer until the company itself would disappear, leaving the British government to take direct control of India. The story of the East India Companies did not end at the shores of India. Their ambitions stretched across the Indian Ocean into Southeast Asia and toward one of the most powerful and sophisticated economies in the world, China. For Britain, China represented something both fascinating and frustrating. The British public had developed an enormous appetite for Chinese tea. Tea became a central part of everyday life in Britain. It was consumed in homes, coffee houses, and wealthy households across the country. But there was a problem. Britain wanted Chinese goods. China wanted very few British goods in return. Chinese merchants supplied tea, silk, and porcelain products that were enormously popular in Europe. British merchants, however, struggled to find products that Chinese buyers wanted in comparable quantities. The result was a persistent trade imbalance. Large quantities of silver flowed from Britain and other European markets toward China. Silver was essential to the Chinese economy and taxation system, and Chinese demand for the precious metal remained strong. For British merchants, this created a serious financial problem. They needed a commodity that could be sold in China and generate revenue that could offset the enormous cost of importing tea. The British East India Company became deeply involved in this search. China's commercial system was highly regulated. European merchants were not free to trade wherever they wished. Under the Qing dynasty, foreign trade was concentrated largely through the port of Canton, now Guangzhou. European merchants had to operate within rules established by Chinese authorities and conduct much of their business through authorized Chinese merchants. The system limited foreign access. For the East India Company, this meant that its commercial ambitions were constrained by a government that remained far more powerful than the company within China. The company could not simply build a network of fortified territories as it had done elsewhere. It had to negotiate, and so for decades, tea became one of the central products connecting Britain and China. Ships carried silver toward China. They returned loaded with tea, silk, and porcelain. The demand for tea continued to grow, and the more Britain consumed, the more silver was required to pay for it. Eventually, British merchants found another commodity: opium. Opium had been produced in parts of India, especially Bengal and surrounding regions, and the East India Company became deeply connected to its production and trade. The company did not simply sell opium directly in China, in the same way it sold tea in Britain. Instead, a complex system developed involving company-controlled production, auctions, and private merchants who transported the drug toward the Chinese market. The consequences were enormous. Opium consumption expanded in China. Silver began moving in the opposite direction. Instead of silver continuously flowing toward China to pay for British imports, increasing amounts of silver moved out of China through the opium trade. For British merchants, this helped solve the problem of the trade imbalance. But for Chinese authorities, the situation was becoming increasingly alarming. Opium addiction was causing severe social and economic problems. Officials worried about the health of the population. They were concerned about silver leaving the country, and they increasingly viewed the foreign opium trade as a threat to the stability of the Qing state. Chinese authorities attempted to suppress the trade. The conflict eventually reached a critical point in the late 1830s. In 1839, the Qing official Lin Zexu was sent to Canton with orders to take decisive action against the illegal opium trade. Large quantities of opium were confiscated and destroyed. For British merchants, the destruction represented a major financial loss. For Chinese authorities, it was an assertion of their right to enforce their own laws. The confrontation escalated. Britain sent military forces. The resulting conflict became known as the First Opium War, lasting from 1839 to 1842. British naval technology and military organization gave Britain a significant advantage. Chinese forces struggled to respond effectively to the modern weapons and tactics of the British fleet. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking. China was forced to make significant concessions, including opening additional ports to foreign trade and ceding Hong Kong to Britain. The conflict marked a profound change in China's relationship with Western powers. It also revealed something important about the age of corporate empire. Commercial interests could lead to military conflict. Trade could become a matter of national power, and a company's economic ambitions could eventually become entangled with the military resources of an entire state. The East India Company had spent centuries searching for profitable trade routes. In India, it had acquired territory. In China, it encountered a government unwilling to accept unrestricted foreign commerce. The resulting confrontation demonstrated the limits of corporate power and the growing willingness of the British state to use military force to protect commercial interests. The history of tea, silver, and opium is therefore not simply a story about commodities. It is a story about unequal trade. It is a story about addiction and human suffering. It is a story about sovereignty and foreign intervention. And it is a story about what happens when commercial ambition becomes powerful enough to influence international politics. The tea that became a beloved British tradition had connected two enormous economies, but behind every cup was a complicated chain of production, shipping, silver, taxation, diplomacy, and conflict. And behind that chain was a much darker question: how far could a trading empire go in pursuit of profit before commerce itself became a cause of war? By the 18th century, tea had become far more than a luxury in Britain. It had become part of everyday life. People drank it in wealthy homes, merchant houses, taverns, and eventually across almost every level of British society. A simple cup of tea could represent comfort, hospitality, conversation, and routine. But behind that familiar drink was an enormous global network. Tea was grown in China. It crossed the oceans aboard merchant ships. It passed through the commercial system of the East India Company. And eventually, it reached British consumers. The company played a central role in Britain's tea trade, importing enormous quantities of Chinese tea, and helping establish a powerful commercial connection between Britain and Asia. But tea was expensive, and one reason was taxation. The British government placed duties on imported tea, partly because taxation was an important source of state revenue. Yet high taxes created another problem. Smuggling became profitable. Large quantities of tea entered Britain illegally, avoiding official duties. This reduced government revenue and threatened the East India Company's ability to sell its tea through normal channels. The British government attempted to solve the problem with the Tea Act of 1773. The legislation allowed the East India Company to sell tea more directly to the American colonies and made its tea cheaper in some circumstances, while preserving the existing colonial tax on tea. From the perspective of British officials, the measure was designed to help the financially troubled company and maintain the government's authority over colonial taxation. But many American colonists saw something very different. They objected to being taxed by a parliament in which they had no elected representatives. To them, the issue was not simply the price of tea. It was the principle behind the tax. Who had the right to impose it? Could Britain determine the economic rules of the colonies without their consent? And if the East India Company received special privileges from Parliament, what did that say about the relationship between corporate power and political power? Tensions intensified. In December 1773, a group of American colonists boarded ships in Boston Harbor. They opened crates of tea belonging to the East India Company. Then they threw the tea into the water. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. Hundreds of chests of tea were destroyed. The act was dramatic, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. The colonists were not simply rejecting a beverage. They were protesting taxation, political authority, and what they saw as an unfair system that favored a powerful corporation. The East India Company had become an unexpected symbol of British authority. For the colonists, the tea represented the larger problem. A distant government could grant privileges to a giant company. That company could receive special access to colonial markets. And ordinary people were expected to accept the economic consequences. The destruction of the tea therefore became a political statement. Britain responded harshly. The British government passed a series of measures known in the colonies as the Coercive Acts, intended to punish Massachusetts and restore imperial authority. Instead, the measures increased colonial resistance. Other colonies rallied around Boston. Political cooperation expanded. And the confrontation between Britain and the American colonies moved closer to open war. In 1775, the American Revolution began. The East India Company's tea had not caused the revolution by itself. The causes were much broader, involving taxation, representation, imperial administration, political rights, and years of growing tension. But the Boston Tea Party became one of the defining moments on the road to revolution. It demonstrated something remarkable. A product as ordinary as tea could become a weapon of political protest. A company created to make profits in distant markets had become part of a conflict over freedom and government. And the East India Company found itself at the center of a political struggle far beyond India. This was the paradox of corporate empire. The company moved commodities across oceans. But those commodities also moved ideas. Tea connected China to Britain. Britain connected the company to North America. And North American resistance connected a commercial dispute to a revolution. The journey of a single chest of tea could therefore pass through farms, warehouses, ships, ports, customs offices, government ministries, and finally a colonial harbor. Every stage involved power. Every stage involved money. And every stage revealed how closely commerce and politics had become connected. The East India Company had once been founded by merchants searching for profitable opportunities in Asia. Now its products were helping ignite political resistance thousands of miles away. Tea had become more than a commodity. It had become a symbol of taxation, a symbol of imperial authority, a symbol of corporate privilege, and, for the American colonists who threw it into Boston Harbor, a symbol of resistance. The story of the East India Company was no longer confined to India or Asia. Its influence had reached across the globe. And with every ship, every crate, and every transaction, the company continued to demonstrate a remarkable truth. Sometimes the smallest objects can carry the weight of enormous political power. The American Revolution changed far more than the political map of North America. It also disrupted the commercial networks of the British Empire. For the East India Company, this was a serious problem. The company depended upon international trade. Its ships moved goods across oceans. Its merchants relied on established markets. Its investors expected regular profits, and its enormous organization required constant flows of money. The American colonies had been part of that wider commercial system. But when relations between Britain and the colonies collapsed, the company's economic environment became increasingly uncertain. The conflict that began in the 1770s disrupted shipping, trade and investment. British merchants faced new risks. Ships could be captured. Cargoes could be lost. Markets could disappear. And military expenses continued to rise. The American Revolution was not simply a colonial rebellion. It became part of a much larger international conflict involving Britain, France, Spain, and other powers. For Britain, fighting a war across the Atlantic was extraordinarily expensive. The government needed soldiers, ships, weapons, supplies, and money, and the East India Company faced its own financial pressures at the same time. This created a dangerous combination. The company was enormous. Its territories in India generated substantial revenue. Its trading network stretched across continents. Its armies were larger than those of many European states. Yet size did not guarantee financial stability. The company had enormous expenses. Maintaining armies was expensive. Running forts and administrative centers required money. Supporting trade routes required ships and crews. Political instability could disrupt revenue, and wars could consume enormous amounts of capital. The company therefore continued to depend upon support from the British government. This relationship revealed a remarkable contradiction. The East India Company was powerful enough to govern territories and fight wars, but when financial crisis threatened its survival, it could turn toward the British state for assistance. The government, in turn, had reasons to help. If the company collapsed, the consequences could be enormous. Thousands of investors could lose money. British banks and merchants could suffer. Trade could be disrupted. Government finances could be affected, and Britain's position in India could be threatened. The company had therefore become too important to fail. But keeping such an organization alive came at a cost. Government assistance meant greater political supervision. Parliament increasingly demanded information. Politicians questioned company management. Critics examined the company's finances. And every crisis created another argument for stronger government control. The American Revolution had therefore exposed a larger truth about global corporations. A company could operate across oceans. It could possess enormous wealth. It could maintain armies. It could control territory. But it remained vulnerable to events beyond its control. Wars could destroy trade routes. Political revolutions could close markets. Financial crises could weaken even the largest organization. The East India Company had become one of the most powerful commercial institutions in the world. Yet power was not the same as invincibility. Its history was becoming a cycle of expansion and crisis. The more territory it controlled, the more expensive administration became. The more soldiers it employed, the more money it needed. The more political responsibilities it accepted, the greater the risks. And the more the British government supported it, the less independent it became. This was the paradox of the corporate empire. The company had originally been created to take commercial risks on behalf of private investors, but its success had transformed those risks into matters of national importance. When the company succeeded, Britain benefited. When the company struggled, Britain was increasingly expected to intervene. The boundary between private business and public responsibility had almost disappeared. Meanwhile, the global economy continued to change. American independence created new trading relationships. European powers continued competing for overseas markets. Asian commerce remained enormously valuable, and Britain increasingly depended upon its expanding imperial network. The East India Company remained at the center of this system, but it was no longer operating as the confident merchant organization of the previous century. It was becoming an institution under pressure. Its wealth was enormous. Its political influence was enormous. Its responsibilities were enormous, and so were its debts and risks. The lesson was becoming impossible to ignore. Economic power does not guarantee survival. A corporation can become powerful enough to influence governments and still depend upon those governments for protection. It can possess armies and territories and face bankruptcy. It can dominate markets and still be threatened by political events beyond its control. The East India Company had spent generations building an empire of commerce. But maintaining that empire required something that money alone could not provide: stability. And stability was becoming increasingly difficult to find. The company had survived wars, political revolutions, famine, corruption scandals, and financial crises. But every crisis pushed it closer toward a new reality. The East India Company was no longer simply a private company operating within the British Empire. It had become one of the pillars of that empire. And once a corporation becomes a pillar of the state, its failures can no longer be treated as ordinary business failures. They become national crises. The company had reached extraordinary heights, but its greatest challenge was no longer conquering new markets. It was surviving the enormous system it had created. When people hear the words East India Company, they often think immediately of Britain or the Netherlands. But during the great age of global trade, several European countries created their own companies to compete for the wealth of Asia. Some were ambitious. Some were surprisingly successful for short periods. Others disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Together, they reveal an important truth about the world of early global commerce. The race for Asia was open to many players, but only a few had the resources to survive. One of the more interesting examples was the Swedish East India Company, founded in 1731. Sweden was not a global naval superpower on the scale of Britain or the Netherlands. Yet Swedish merchants recognized the enormous profits available through Asian trade. The company established connections with China, particularly through the port of Canton. Swedish ships carried European goods and silver toward Asia and returned with porcelain, silk, and other valuable commodities. For a time, the business could be highly profitable, but the Swedish company faced a fundamental disadvantage. It lacked the enormous political and military infrastructure possessed by Britain and the Dutch Republic. It could trade, but it could not easily protect a worldwide commercial empire. It had fewer ships, less capital, and far fewer overseas territories. The Danish East India Company faced a similar challenge. Denmark entered the Asian trade during the 17th century and established a presence in India, including the settlement of Tranquebar. Danish merchants participated in the trade of spices, textiles, and other Asian goods. Later, Danish interests also became connected to trade with China. For a relatively small European kingdom, this was an ambitious undertaking, but the Danish company never reached the scale of the Dutch VOC or the British East India Company. Its trading network remained comparatively limited. Its ability to project military power was also restricted. Then there was the Ostend Company. Based in the Austrian Netherlands, the company was founded in the early 18th century, with support from merchants seeking access to Asian markets. Its ambitions were significant. Its ships traveled toward India and China. Its merchants hoped to challenge established European companies, but the company faced intense diplomatic pressure. Britain and the Dutch Republic were already powerful commercial rivals, and they had little interest in allowing another European state to establish a major Asian trading network. The Ostend Company was eventually suspended under international political pressure. Its short history demonstrated something important. Global trade was never simply a contest between merchants. It was also a contest between states. A company could possess skilled traders and profitable routes, but if its home government lacked diplomatic and military power, its competitors could potentially restrict its ambitions. This was the fundamental problem faced by many smaller East India companies. Global commerce required enormous amounts of capital. Ships were expensive. Crews had to be paid. Cargoes had to be purchased. Fortifications had to be built. Trading posts needed employees. And military protection could cost enormous sums. A company with only a handful of ships could not easily compete with an organization capable of sending fleets across multiple oceans. The difference became even greater when companies began acquiring territories. The Dutch and English developed large networks of ports, forts, colonies, and administrative centers. These possessions generated revenue and provided strategic bases. A ship could be repaired in a friendly harbor. A fleet could be supplied from colonial territory. Soldiers could be recruited locally. Merchants could operate under military protection. The system reinforced itself. More territory created more resources. More resources supported larger fleets. Larger fleets protected more trade. And more trade generated additional wealth. Smaller companies struggled to create this same cycle. They often depended on a limited number of voyages. A single lost ship could represent a major financial disaster. A war could destroy a trading post. A diplomatic agreement between larger powers could close access to important markets. And changing prices could turn a profitable expedition into a loss. There was another problem. The biggest companies had already built relationships with powerful Asian states and merchants. They had decades of experience. They understood regional politics. They possessed established warehouses and trading networks. A newcomer had to compete not only against European rivals, but also against sophisticated Asian commercial systems. By the 18th century, the global trading environment was therefore becoming increasingly concentrated. Many companies had entered the race, but fewer were able to survive. The strongest competitors possessed three essential advantages: capital, naval power, political protection. The Dutch VOC had enormous financial resources and a powerful fleet. The English East India Company increasingly benefited from Britain's growing naval and military strength. France remained a major competitor for a time, but its company faced political and financial limitations. Smaller nations could participate in Asian commerce, but maintaining a truly global corporate empire was another matter. The world of East India companies was slowly becoming a contest between the strongest states. Trade had begun as an opportunity for individual merchants. It evolved into a competition between corporations. Then those corporations became extensions of national power. By this stage, economic success depended increasingly on military strength, political influence, and access to overseas territory. The age of many competing companies was gradually giving way to an age dominated by a smaller number of powerful empires. And among them, Britain would eventually emerge as the most formidable. The story of the smaller East India companies is therefore not simply a story of failure, It is a story about the enormous scale of global competition. They proved that almost any European nation could dream of reaching Asia. But dreams required ships. Ships required money. Money required markets. And markets increasingly required military and political power. In the end, the greatest commercial empires were not simply the companies with the best merchants. They were the companies backed by the strongest systems of capital, naval power, diplomacy, and empire. The global marketplace was becoming a battlefield where only the strongest players could remain. And as the competition narrowed, one company was preparing to become the most extraordinary corporate power the world had ever seen. For much of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, had appeared almost unstoppable. It possessed fleets of ships, fortified ports, armies, trading posts, and enormous commercial influence across Asia. But power created its own costs. The larger the VOC became, the more expensive it was to maintain. Its territories required administrators. Its forts required soldiers. Its ships required crews and repairs. And its endless commercial ambitions demanded a constant flow of capital. Over time, the company's greatest strength began to become one of its greatest weaknesses. The VOC had become too large to manage cheaply. Corruption also became a serious problem. Company officials sometimes used their positions for personal gain, while the enormous distance between Asia and the Netherlands made effective supervision difficult. The company operated thousands of miles from Amsterdam, and information traveled slowly. Local officials possessed considerable freedom. The result was an organization in which private interests could increasingly compete with the interests of the corporation itself. At the same time, the VOC became deeply involved in warfare. It had originally been created to make profits from trade, but protecting monopolies required military power. Maintaining military power required money, and military campaigns could last for years. The company fought conflicts across its Asian territories while also competing against European rivals. Every war consumed resources. Every fort needed supplies. Every fleet required maintenance. The military burden became increasingly difficult to support. Meanwhile, the English East India Company was growing stronger. Britain's expanding naval power created a formidable competitor. The British Company was increasingly capable of challenging Dutch commercial dominance. Markets that had once seemed secure were becoming contested. Trade routes shifted. Profits declined. And the VOC's monopoly became harder to maintain. The company also accumulated enormous debts. Its revenues were no longer sufficient to cover its growing expenses. Dividends and obligations placed additional pressure on its finances. By the late 18th century, the once powerful corporation was struggling to survive. The final blow came during a period of major political upheaval in Europe. The Dutch Republic itself was transformed by the Revolutionary Era. The old political order weakened, while France and Britain continued competing for influence. The VOC could no longer operate as the independent corporate power it had once been. In 1799, after nearly 2 centuries of existence, the Dutch East India Company was formally dissolved. Its debts, possessions, and remaining territories were transferred to the Dutch state. The company had disappeared, but its empire did not disappear with it. The Dutch government inherited the territories and administrative structures that the VOC had built. A private corporation had created an overseas empire, and eventually the state became its successor. The story of the VOC therefore ended with an extraordinary reversal. It had begun as a company created by merchants. It had become one of the most powerful corporations on earth. It possessed armies, fleets, forts, and territories. It could negotiate treaties and wage wars, yet none of that guaranteed permanent survival. Corruption weakened its administration. Military commitments drained its finances. Competition reduced its commercial dominance, and debt eventually became too heavy to carry. The VOC's collapse demonstrated a fundamental truth about corporate power. An organization can become enormous without becoming invincible. The company had once seemed almost like a state. But unlike a state, it ultimately depended upon financial performance. When the money stopped flowing strongly enough, the system began to break apart. In the end, the VOC was absorbed by the very state whose interests it had once helped advance. Its ships disappeared. Its corporate structure vanished. Its shareholders lost their great institution. But its legacy remained. Across Indonesia and the wider Indian Ocean world, the company's presence had left deep political, economic, and social consequences. The Dutch East India Company had shown the world that a corporation could possess extraordinary power. Its collapse showed the other side of that lesson. Corporate empires can rise like kingdoms, but they can also fall like them. By the 19th century, the British East India Company had become something almost impossible to recognize. Compared to a merchant organization founded centuries earlier, it still carried the name of a company, but in practice, it governed enormous territories across India. It collected revenue, it administered courts, it negotiated with Indian rulers, it maintained roads and communication systems, and most importantly, it possessed an enormous army. The company had become a government in almost every meaningful sense, yet its authority remained complicated. Britain had increased its supervision over the company, especially after Parliament introduced a series of reforms. But the company continued to administer much of India through its own institutions. Its officials were responsible for decisions affecting millions of people. Its military forces defended company territory and expanded British influence, and its administrators increasingly believed they were responsible for transforming the regions they governed. This created new debates. What should company rule look like? Should the company focus primarily on revenue and stability? Should it attempt to reform Indian society? How much should British customs and ideas influence local institutions? And where should the company draw the line between administration and interference? These questions became increasingly sensitive. The company's army was also changing. The Sepoy Army became the foundation of British military power in India. Most soldiers were Indian serving under European officers, and within a military system increasingly organized according to British methods. This arrangement allowed the company to maintain a huge force without relying entirely on European soldiers. But it also created a delicate relationship. Sepoys served the company, but they came from different communities, regions, and religious traditions. Their loyalty depended on pay, military discipline, political circumstances, and trust. As the 19th century progressed, that trust became increasingly fragile. British administrators also introduced new policies affecting law, education, land, and social practices. Some reforms were presented as attempts to modernize society. Others were motivated by administrative efficiency or economic interests. But many Indians experienced these changes as increasing foreign interference. Cultural differences became more visible. Religious concerns became especially important. British officials sometimes misunderstood local traditions, while Indian communities increasingly questioned the intentions of colonial authorities. The company was becoming more powerful, but power did not necessarily create legitimacy. This was one of its greatest problems. A merchant can leave a market, a government cannot. The East India Company could no longer simply withdraw from difficult situations. It had responsibilities to collect taxes, maintain order, defend territory, and manage relationships with local rulers. Every decision affected millions of people. The company's transformation was therefore almost complete. It had begun as a commercial organization seeking access to Asian markets. It had acquired trading posts, then forts, then armies, then territory, then taxation authority. Now it governed a vast population. The company was no longer merely participating in Indian politics. It was the political system. But this created a dangerous contradiction. The company was still ultimately a corporation. Its shareholders expected financial returns. Its directors were responsible for the organization's finances. Yet its administrators increasingly had to think like government officials. They faced questions about justice, religion, education, public order, military discipline, and social stability. The two identities were becoming impossible to reconcile, and beneath this system, resentment was growing. Among soldiers, among rulers, among landowners, among communities affected by administrative changes, among people who feared that traditional institutions were being weakened. The East India Company had spent more than a century building its authority, but the stronger it became, the more people could oppose it. And when a company controls an enormous army, even a small breakdown in trust can become dangerous. By the middle of the 19th century, the company stood at the height of its territorial power. Yet beneath that surface of strength were deep tensions. Its army was enormous. Its administration was extensive. Its political authority was greater than ever. But its relationship with the people it governed was becoming increasingly unstable. The company had become a government, and governments are judged not only by their wealth or military strength, but by their ability to maintain trust. Soon, that trust would be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The Sepoy army would rise, and when the rebellion began in 1857, Britain would finally confront the question it had postponed for generations. Could a private company still be allowed to rule an empire? By the middle of the 19th century, the East India Company controlled an enormous part of India. Its armies were large. Its administrators governed millions. Its officials collected revenue and enforced British law. But beneath this appearance of stability, resentment was growing. Among many Sepoy soldiers, there were concerns about military discipline, pay promotion and cultural interference. Among Indian rulers and landowners, there was growing opposition to British expansion and policies that threatened traditional authority. And among ordinary people, economic and social changes created further uncertainty. Then, in 1857, the tension exploded. The immediate spark came within the Bengal army. Rumors spread that new rifle cartridges were graced with animal fat, considered offensive by both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. Whether every detail of the rumor was accurate mattered less than what represented. Many Sepoys already feared that the British were deliberately interfering with their religious traditions. Resistance spread. In May 1857, soldiers at Meerut rebelled and marched toward Delhi. There, they declared the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as a symbolic leader. The rebellion quickly expanded. Delhi became one of its major centers. Other important uprisings emerged at Kanpur and Lucknow, while resistance spread across parts of northern and central India. For several months, the British faced a crisis unlike anything the company had experienced before. The conflict was chaotic. Different groups joined the rebellion for different reasons. Some soldiers fought against British authority. Some rulers hoped to recover lost power. Some communities resisted economic and political changes. The uprising, therefore, was not a single movement with one unified objective, but together these forces created a major threat to company rule. The British responded with military force. British troops, loyal Indian soldiers, and reinforcements from overseas were mobilized. Delhi was eventually recaptured. Other rebel strongholds fell one after another. The fighting was brutal, and both sides committed acts of violence. Thousands died during battles, reprisals, sieges, and the chaos surrounding the rebellion. By 1858, the major centers of resistance had been defeated. The East India Company had survived the uprising militarily, but politically, it had suffered a fatal blow. The British government could no longer justify allowing a private corporation to control such an enormous and unstable territory. The rebellion had demonstrated the risks of company rule. The East India Company had possessed an army. It had administered territories. It had collected taxes. It had governed millions of people. Yet when that system faced a major crisis, the British state itself had to intervene directly. The conclusion was increasingly unavoidable. India could no longer be governed as the possession of a private company. In 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The East India Company's political authority was abolished. Control of India was transferred directly to the British Crown. The company that had begun centuries earlier as a group of merchants seeking access to Asian markets had finally lost the power it had spent generations building. Its army was reorganized. Its administrative functions were transferred. Its political authority disappeared. India entered a new era of direct British rule. The irony was profound. The East India Company had become powerful because it could behave like a state, but eventually its greatest crisis came because it was not a state. Its private origins, commercial priorities, military structure, and political ambitions had created a system that became too complicated and too dangerous to remain independent. The revolt of 1857 therefore marked more than the end of a rebellion. It marked the end of an experiment. For nearly 2.5 centuries, the East India Company had demonstrated how private corporation could go when backed by capital, ships, soldiers, and political privilege. It had begun with trade. It had acquired forts, then armies, then taxation rights, then territories, and finally, the authority to govern an enormous part of India. But in 1858, that extraordinary journey came to an end. The company lost India. The British Crown took its place. And one of history's most remarkable corporate experiments disappeared from the political stage. Yet its legacy remained. The borders, institutions, economic systems, military traditions, and memories created during company rule would continue shaping India and Britain for generations. The company was gone, but the empire it had helped build was only entering a new chapter. In 1858, the East India Company lost the power that had defined it for generations. For more than 2 centuries, the company had evolved from a group of merchants into one of the most powerful corporate institutions in history. It had traded across oceans. It had built forts. It had maintained armies. It collected taxes. It had controlled territories. And it had governed millions of people. But after the revolt of 1857, Britain decided that this extraordinary experiment had gone too far. The answer came with the Government of India Act of 1858. The legislation formally ended the East India Company's role as the governing authority in India. Power was transferred directly to the British Crown. India would no longer be administered in the name of a private corporation. Instead, it would become directly governed by the British state. The change was profound. For generations, the company had stood between Britain and India. Now that intermediary was gone, the British government assumed responsibility for Indian administration, diplomacy, and military affairs. A Secretary of State for India was created in London, while the Crown appointed a Viceroy to represent British authority in India. The East India Company had lost the political power it had spent centuries building, but it did not disappear overnight. The corporation itself continued to exist for a short period in a greatly reduced form. Its commercial identity had already faded substantially before 1858. Its monopoly over trade had been dismantled decades earlier. Its political authority was now gone. What remained was essentially the shell of an institution that had once stretched across the world. The company that had once commanded fleets and armies now had no empire to govern. Its extraordinary transformation had come full circle. It had begun as a commercial experiment. It had become a territorial power. And finally, it had been absorbed into the machinery of the state. In 1874, Parliament formally dissolved the East India Company. More than 2 centuries after its creation, the company was officially gone. Its final disappearance was surprisingly quiet compared with dramatic events that had marked its rise. There was no great final battle, no final voyage, no enormous fleets sailing into the sunset. Instead, the corporation simply ceased to exist. Its name remained in history, but its legal existence ended. Yet the end of the company did not mean the end of its legacy. Far from it. The political and economic systems it had helped create continued long after the corporation disappeared. British institutions expanded throughout India. The administrative structures developed during company rule were adapted and reorganized. The Indian Army continued under the authority of the Crown. Railways, telegraph networks, ports, and other infrastructure expanded during the later colonial period. The economic relationships created during earlier centuries continued to influence global trade. And the memory of company rule remained deeply connected to questions about colonialism, wealth, power, and exploitation. The East India Company's story, therefore, cannot be reduced to a simple rise and fall. It was a transformation. A merchant company entered Asia searching for profit. It encountered powerful civilizations and sophisticated markets. It built trading posts. It established military forces. It became involved in local politics. It acquired territory. It collected revenue. It became a government. And eventually, the government took the company itself away. That journey changed the meaning of a corporation. Before the East India Company, it was difficult to imagine a private business exercising authority on such an enormous scale. After the company, the relationship between commerce, government, and empire could never be understood in quite the same way. Its history also left a warning. Economic power can become political power. Political power can become military power, and military power can eventually create responsibilities that a company was never designed to handle. The East India Company demonstrated both the extraordinary possibilities and the enormous dangers of corporate ambition. Its shareholders sought profit. Its employees sought opportunity. Its directors sought expansion. But the consequences reached far beyond balance sheets and dividends. They affected rulers, soldiers, merchants, farmers, workers, and entire societies. When the company finally disappeared in 1874, more than 270 years of corporate history came to an end. but the world it helped create did not disappear with it. The company was gone. Its empire had become a state empire, and its legacy remained embedded in the modern history of Britain, India, and the global economy. The East India Company had once asked a simple question: how much wealth can trade create? Its history eventually produced a much larger one. What happens when a company becomes powerful enough to rule like a kingdom? When the great East India Companies disappeared, the world they had helped create did not disappear with them. Their ships were gone. Their charters expired. Their corporate offices eventually closed. But across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, the physical and economic structures created during centuries of global commerce remained. Ports were among the most visible legacies. Places such as Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, Batavia, and other trading centers grew from commercial settlements into major cities. Warehouses became districts. Fortified trading posts became administrative centers. Harbors became gateways connecting local economies to global markets. These cities would continue expanding long after the companies themselves had vanished. The companies also helped reshape global trade routes. Goods that had once traveled through regional networks were increasingly carried across oceans. Tea, spices, cotton, silk, porcelain, sugar, coffee, and many other commodities became part of an interconnected world economy. Production itself began changing as demand from distant markets influenced what farmers, artisans, and manufacturers produced. Consumption changed too. A cup of tea in Britain could depend upon workers in China, merchants in India, sailors crossing the Indian Ocean, and financial institutions in London. The world was becoming more connected. Language and culture were also transformed. European languages spread through colonial administration, education, commerce, and migration. British influence left lasting marks on India and other regions, while Dutch, French, Portuguese, Danish and other European cultures also left their own traces. These cultural exchanges were often complex. They could produce new communities, ideas, languages, and artistic traditions. But they also occurred within unequal systems of power. Legal systems were transformed as European institutions were introduced or imposed. Courts, administrative structures, property laws, and commercial regulations developed in ways that would continue influencing many countries long after colonial rule ended. Some of these institutions later became foundations for modern states. Others remained controversial because they had originally been designed to serve colonial interests. Perhaps the greatest legacy was the creation of a truly global commercial system. The East India Companies demonstrated that capital could move across oceans. Goods could be produced in one region, financed in another, transported by ships from another, and sold thousands of miles away. This was an early form of globalization, but globalization did not emerge peacefully. It was often built alongside military power, unequal treaties, monopolies, taxation, forced labor, and colonial expansion. The companies helped create markets, but they also helped create empires. Their legacy is therefore impossible to describe as simply positive or negative. There were developments that later generations regarded as important or beneficial. Ports expanded. Communication networks improved. New commercial connections emerged. Infrastructure grew. Ideas and cultures crossed borders. But these changes came with enormous costs. Local industries were disrupted. Political independence was weakened. Wealth was often transferred from colonized regions toward European investors and states. Wars and famines caused immense suffering, and millions of people lived under political systems they had not chosen. The East India Companies therefore left behind a complicated inheritance. They helped create the foundations of modern global commerce, while also participating in some of the most unequal systems of the imperial age. Their story reminds us that economic progress and human suffering can exist at the same time. A new railway can connect communities while serving colonial extraction. A busy port can create wealth while enriching foreign interests. A legal system can provide stability while originating from an unequal political order. And a global market can connect people while distributing its benefits very unevenly. Perhaps that is why the history of these companies remains so controversial. They were not simply businesses. They were instruments of trade, diplomacy, military power, and empire. They helped transform the world into a connected economic system. But they also demonstrated how dangerous economic power can become when it escapes ordinary political limits. Their ships have disappeared into history. Their offices have become museums, ruins, or forgotten buildings. Their charters are no longer active. Yet their legacy can still be seen in modern cities' languages, laws, trade routes, markets, and political borders. The companies are gone, but the global world they helped build is still here. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: the greatest legacy of these companies was not the wealth they created, but the new relationship they revealed between commerce, power, and the modern world. From trading company to global business long before modern multinational corporations filled the skylines of London, New York, Singapore, and Shanghai, another kind of global business had already begun to emerge. The East India Companies were among the earliest organizations to operate across enormous distances, while combining private investment, international trade, complex administration, and political influence. They were not modern corporations in every sense, but they contained many features that would later become familiar in global business. One of the most important was the idea of shareholders. Instead of relying entirely on one wealthy merchant to finance a voyage, joint stock companies allowed many investors to contribute capital. Their money was pooled together. The company used that capital to purchase ships, hire crews, establish trading posts, buy goods, and finance long-distance expeditions. In return, investors could receive a share of the profits. This created an important separation between the people who owned the company and the people who managed its operations. That separation became one of the foundations of modern corporate capitalism. The East India Companies also demonstrated the power of large-scale joint stock organization. A single merchant could finance one voyage. A large corporation could finance fleets. It could spread risk across hundreds or thousands of investors. If one ship was lost, the entire company did not necessarily collapse. If one market failed, another might remain profitable. This ability to distribute risk allowed companies to operate on a scale that individual merchants could rarely achieve. But their operations required something else: international capital. Money could originate in European financial centers and be invested in voyages thousands of miles away. Profits could return years later. Investors did not need to travel to Asia themselves. They could participate in global commerce from their homes. This was an early form of remote economic participation. The companies also developed sophisticated systems of management. Directors in Europe made strategic decisions. Officials in Asia managed trading posts, warehouses, ships, armies, and negotiations. Messages traveled across oceans. Reports were written. Accounts were recorded. Orders were transmitted over enormous distances. The delays were frustrating, but the basic principle was revolutionary. A single organization could coordinate activities across continents. Modern multinational corporations operate in a remarkably similar way. A company may have headquarters in one country, factories in another, suppliers across several continents, financial operations somewhere else, and customers almost everywhere. The East India companies faced a much slower world. Ships could take months to cross oceans. Information traveled slowly. Communication was uncertain, yet they still created complex transcontinental supply chains. Tea moved from Asian plantations and markets toward European consumers. Indian textiles were purchased, transported, and sold internationally. Spices passed through ports and warehouses separated by thousands of miles. Every stage required coordination: production, finance, transportation, insurance, marketing, and distribution. The companies therefore demonstrated something that would become central to the modern economy. A business did not have to operate in one place. It could become a network. And once a company became a network, its power could expand dramatically. But there was an important difference between these early corporations and modern multinational companies. The East India companies possessed political and military privileges that most modern businesses do not. They could build forts. They could maintain armies. They could negotiate treaties. In some cases, they could acquire territory and collect taxes. That makes their legacy particularly unusual. They were businesses, but they could also function like states. So were the East India companies the first multinational corporations? The answer depends on how we define the term. They were certainly among the earliest corporations to operate on a truly global scale. They had shareholders. They raised large amounts of capital. They managed international trade networks. They maintained overseas offices and settlements, and they coordinated complex operations across continents. In that sense, they can reasonably be described as early ancestors of the multinational corporation, but they were also products of a very different age. Their business models were deeply connected to colonialism, monopoly, military force, and imperial politics. Modern multinational corporations operate within national legal systems and international regulations that did not exist in the same form during the age of the East India companies. The comparison therefore has limits, yet the fundamental idea remains striking. Centuries ago, investors could place money into a company operating on the other side of the world. Managers could make decisions thousands of miles from their shareholders. Goods could cross oceans before reaching consumers, and profits could flow through international financial networks. The technology was primitive compared with today's world. The ships were slow. The communication was uncertain. The information was incomplete. But the organizational idea was already there. A company could become global. And once it did, its influence could extend far beyond the marketplace. The East India companies helped demonstrate the extraordinary power of that idea. They were not modern corporations, but they helped invent the corporate architecture from which the modern global business world would eventually emerge. And their history leaves us with one final question. When a company can operate across borders, move enormous amounts of capital, and influence millions of lives, where should the boundary between business and power really be drawn? There is something almost unbelievable about the East India companies when viewed from the modern world. Today, we usually imagine a company as an organization that sells products, employs workers, manages offices, and competes for customers. We do not normally imagine a company possessing an army. We do not imagine its directors deciding when soldiers should march. And we certainly do not imagine a corporation negotiating treaties or capturing cities. Yet during the age of the East India Companies, this was possible. The question is, why were companies allowed to make war? The answer begins with the world in which these companies were created. European governments wanted access to the wealth of Asia, but sending national armies and fleets across the oceans was enormously expensive. A private company offered an attractive alternative. Investors could provide capital. Merchants could organize voyages. Companies could build ships and trading posts. And governments could grant them special privileges in exchange for expanding national commercial influence. These privileges sometimes included the right to defend their interests with military force. At first, the logic appeared simple. A trading post needed protection. A ship carrying valuable cargo needed armed guards. A fort needed soldiers. But gradually, protection became something much larger. Companies began maintaining permanent armies. They built fortified settlements. They fought rival European powers. They intervened in local political conflicts. And eventually military force became part of the machinery of commerce itself. The logic was often circular. A monopoly generated profits. Profits funded soldiers. Soldiers protected the monopoly. The monopoly then generated more profits. This created a powerful system. But it also blurred the boundary between corporate and state power. The East India Companies were private organizations, yet they exercised powers normally associated with governments. They could negotiate treaties. They could occupy territory. They could impose rules. And in some places they could collect taxes. The result was something historically unusual. Private power operating with public authority. This arrangement created enormous opportunities. A company could act faster than a government. It could take commercial risks. It could establish new markets. But there were also enormous dangers. A company whose profits depended upon controlling a particular commodity had a strong incentive to eliminate competitors. That was the foundation of monopoly. Instead of allowing many merchants to compete freely, companies could attempt to control production, transportation, and prices. Military power made such monopolies even stronger. If a company controlled the ports, protected the ships, and possessed the soldiers, competitors faced enormous obstacles. The history of the spice trade demonstrates this clearly. Control over valuable commodities could become a reason for controlling the territories where those commodities were produced. Trade became territorial power. Territorial power created military obligations, and military obligations created further costs and conflicts. The cycle could continue for generations. Eventually, however, governments had to confront an uncomfortable question. If a private company could make war, who was responsible for the consequences? If soldiers killed people during a commercial conflict, was the company responsible? If a company acquired territory, who governed that territory? If a corporation became wealthy enough to influence parliament or national policy, could it still be considered purely private? These questions were not easy to answer. They remain relevant today, even though modern companies generally do not possess armies in the same way. Modern corporations can still exercise enormous influence through capital, technology, infrastructure, information, and global supply chains. A company may operate in dozens of countries. It may employ hundreds of thousands of people. It may control important technologies or resources. And its decisions can affect entire communities and even national economies. The scale is different. The principle is not. The history of the East India Companies therefore offers an important warning about concentrated power. Economic power can become political power. Political power can influence laws. Laws can protect economic interests. And protected economic interests can become even more powerful. The companies of the early modern world showed what could happen when these forces became concentrated inside a single organization. They were created to make money. But they eventually possessed enough power to shape governments, borders, wars, and societies. Their story reminds us that markets do not exist separately from politics. Trade depends on laws. Commerce depends on security. Businesses depend on governments. And governments can become dependent on powerful businesses. The real lesson is not that companies should never become large. It is that power requires limits. When an organization becomes powerful enough to influence not only what people buy, but where people live, how governments operate, and how conflicts are fought, the distinction between business and politics becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The East India Companies lived in that blurred space for centuries. They were merchants. They were investors. They were administrators. They were military powers. And in some places, they were governments. Their history leaves behind a question that remains remarkably modern. When private economic power becomes powerful enough to shape public life, who should hold it accountable? Return once more to the map of the world. The oceans stretch across the darkness, enormous distances separating continents that once seemed impossibly far apart. But slowly, almost quietly, lines begin to appear. A route from London toward the Indian Ocean. Another from Amsterdam towards Southeast Asia. Ships moving between India and China. Ports connecting merchants, sailors, soldiers, bankers, and ordinary workers. The world is beginning to look different. At one end of this network stands London. It is becoming one of the great financial centers of the emerging global economy. From London, investors provide capital. Merchants organize voyages. Company directors make decisions about distant markets. And ships depart carrying silver, manufactured goods, and instructions for officials thousands of miles away. Across the North Sea stands Amsterdam. For much of the 17th century, Amsterdam is at the heart of Dutch commercial power. Its merchants and financiers help support the VOC. Money flows through its markets. Ships leave its harbor. And information from Asia eventually returns to its counting houses. Far away, on the other side of the world, lies Calcutta. What began as a trading settlement becomes one of the most important centers of British power in India. Its position connects the company to Bengal's enormous economy and to wider networks stretching across the Indian Ocean. Further east lies Batavia, the great center of Dutch power in Southeast Asia. From here, the VOC manages ships, warehouses, soldiers, administrators, and trade across the Indonesian archipelago. Spices pass through its ports. Messages arrive from distant islands. Orders are sent outward across the sea, and another line appears on the map. It leads toward Canton, one of the principal gateways through which European merchants interacted with China's vast commercial system. Here, silk, porcelain, and silver became part of a complicated global exchange. Then the map turns back toward India. Bombay, a harbor that would grow into one of the most important cities in South Asia. Its strategic position made it valuable to merchants and governments alike. Further south lies Madras, another major center of British commerce. Its fort, warehouses, ships, and merchants connected southern India to markets across the Indian Ocean. These cities were separated by enormous distances, but the sea connected them. Ships carried goods. Sailors carried information. Merchants carried credit. Governments carried ambitions. And people carried cultures from one shore to another. This was an early form of globalization. It was not the instantaneous world we know today. A message could take months to cross the ocean. A voyage could be dangerous. Ships could disappear. Cargoes could be destroyed. And markets could change before merchants even received the news. Yet the network existed. London could depend on tea from Asia. Amsterdam could profit from spices in Indonesia. Indian textiles could reach European consumers. Chinese porcelain could appear in distant households. Silver mined in the Americas could eventually reach Asian markets. The oceans had become highways of commerce. But these routes carried more than goods. They carried languages, religions, technologies, ideas, diseases, conflicts, and political ambitions. The global network created by the East India Companies was therefore both extraordinary and deeply unequal. It connected distant societies, but it also enabled conquest. It created wealth, but wealth was not distributed equally. It encouraged cultural exchange, but it also accompanied colonial domination. Still, from the perspective of history, the transformation was remarkable. Cities that once belonged primarily to regional networks became connected to an emerging global system. The map of the world was no longer a collection of isolated economic regions. It was becoming a web, and at the center of that web was the sea. The ships have long disappeared. The wooden docks have changed. The old company offices have fallen silent, but many of the cities remain. London, Amsterdam, Calcutta, Betanzin, Bombay, Madras. Their histories are different. Their futures are different. Yet for centuries, they were connected by the same great experiment, the attempt to turn oceans into roads and trade into global power. And from those sea routes, the foundations of our interconnected world slowly began to emerge. And now, as our journey slowly comes to an end, let us return once more to the ocean. A small sailing ship moves quietly across the dark water. The wind fills its ancient sails. Behind it, the horizon disappears into the night. There are no voices now, no cannons, no crowded markets, only the gentle movement of the sea. Along distant shores, old warehouses stand silently beneath the moonlight. Some have disappeared completely. Others have become part of modern cities, their walls surrounded by streets, lights, and millions of people who may never know what once happened there. The ports have changed. The ships have changed. The world has changed. But the story remains. The East India Companies began with a remarkably simple idea: buy goods where they were cheap and sell them where they were expensive. At first, it was about spices, silk, tea, pork, textiles, silver. But commerce created competition. Competition created the desire for control. Control created monopoly, and monopoly created power. Soon protecting trade required forts. Forts required soldiers. Soldiers created armies. Armies became involved in politics, and politics eventually became empire. What began as a business could command ships, control territory, collect taxes, negotiate treaties, and influence the fate of millions. That is perhaps the most fascinating and unsettling part of this story. The companies did not begin by setting out to become kingdoms. Yet, step by step, decision by decision, profit by profit, they moved closer to becoming something that looked remarkably like a state. And so, as the waves continue beneath that lonely ship, one final question remains: when does a company stop being a company and become an empire? Perhaps there is no single moment. Perhaps it happens gradually, when commerce becomes power and power begins to shape the world around it. For now, let the story become quiet again. Let the distant ports fade into darkness. Let the sound of the ocean carry us away from the empires, the battles, and the endless pursuit of wealth. Thank you for spending this time with Chill and Feel Chronicles. If you enjoyed this journey through history, gently subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories from the past. Until our next journey, good night, and may history continue to whisper softly in your dreams.